Captain Midnight.
This video is brought to you by Nebula. So, as the studios and WGA reached a new deal for industry writers a couple weeks ago, a piece of news came out that I found very interesting. According to Puck, a pretty reputable Hollywood industry newsletter, NBC Universal is planning an Office reboot with the creator of the US Office, Greg Daniels. Puck then went on to clarify, quote, right before the strike, Daniels was closing a pact to return to the format and see if he can come up with something worth making. Now, post-strike, he'll close the deal and do just that. NBC and Universal Television, which licensed the format from creators Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant, would certainly love to make a new version. They've been talking about it for years, but this is still a ways away. Puck also acted baffled that some people were upset by this news, pointing out that the US Office was already a redo of the British Office. Well, while I'm definitely not outraged by the concept or anything, I think a reboot or continuation of the US Office would be a mistake, not to mention a very, very different situation from adapting the original. I will grant that the practice of making American remakes of UK sitcoms was not, even in 2005, the freshest or most exciting idea in the world. Most of them turn out terribly, and at first the US Office started out on pretty rocky terrain as well, trying to hew as close to the droll, more grounded approach of the original, and coming off as a pale imitation in the process. But once it found its voice, it was able to carve out a path of its own. And as someone who really likes both of these shows, where the US Office ended up was very, very far from the tone of the Merchant and Gervais show, for better and sometimes for worse. But it was helped by the fact that it was based on a show that ran for a total of 12 episodes and a Christmas special. Whereas any Office reboot would be picking up the pieces of a series that ran for 201 episodes. I think that's a pretty massive and obvious difference. There was still a lot of fertile ground to this premise in 2005, but after 9 seasons, less so, especially since it already ran a season or two too long. I think everything there was to say about these characters has been said. Tearful farewells have been given in both Michael's last episode and the fairly strong series finale. There's no reason to go back to this well, aside from the fact that Peacock could really use some more eyeballs right now. But okay, let's take the concept of a rebooted Office a little more seriously, and give them the benefit of the doubt. Greg Daniels has made some TV I really like, so that only seems fair. I think there's plenty of potential in setting a sitcom in a modern day office. Office culture has obviously changed a lot since the 2000s and early 2010s. And honestly, the setting of the office in the show bears more resemblance to 90s movies like Office Space than it does to the current reality of what office workers deal with. There's probably plenty of good comedy material to be mined out of, say, a show where employees are forced to come back to work after years of being remote. I assume that an Office reboot would try to tackle some of that stuff. I think that's basically guaranteed, because if you're making the show and trying to justify its existence, I'm sure the first thing that would come to mind is how different the Office experience is in the 2020s. It's not that part that I have a problem with. I just don't think attaching it to the old show is the best way to go about that at all, and could actually be a massive hindrance in just about every way except the marketing. I mean, just take a look at the last decade or so of sitcoms coming back from the dead. The track record, I wouldn't say it's promising. Like, remember when Will and Grace came back for multiple seasons a few years ago? It felt like no one really noticed, and I wasn't the biggest fan of the show in the first place, but most would agree it fell really short of its old run. The iCarly reboot was quietly put out to pasture recently after 3 years of banking on nostalgia. Full House was rebooted as Fuller House, and I mean, I guess that was considered a success. It ran for years and was just as dull and toothless as the real thing, so sure. Roseanne and the Connors are obviously a really weird case, with the lead being fired and then the replacement show running for years. I'll admit, I haven't watched much of either one of those. Then there's an older reboot that still stings for me, Arrested Development, whose later 2 seasons, while having their moments, especially season 4, are such a colossal downgrade from the razor-sharp first 3 that I really wish they had just never left Fox. There are exceptions, like the very short third season of Party Down that came out this year, but that felt different since the original only had 20 episodes or so in the first place. For the most part, when sitcoms come back with a lot of the returning cast, it just doesn't tend to work out very well. The chemistry has changed, everyone is much older, and obviously so many stories have already been told with these characters. This tends to cause a lot of them, like the Will and Grace revival, to lean more on topical references to current events, which often come off as lazy rehashes of jokes and opinions that you've already seen on social media. But you might be thinking, what if it was an all-new cast or a mostly new cast? Famously, Frasier was a spinoff of Cheers and placed the character in a new context with a new cast. Something that they're aiming to do again this month, by the way, with that Frasier revival on Paramount Plus that is supposed to start any day now. But generally, I don't know if there's much of an appetite for these. Take Hulu's How I Met Your Father, which was just canned after 2 seasons. The problem that shows like this have a lot of the time is that many fans just view them as a way to check in on what the characters from the old show are up to now. How I Met Your Father could really only gain any traction or attention online by bringing back Robin or mentioning Ted or whoever. It didn't win over enough viewers who just wanted to watch the show for Hilary Duff and the rest of the cast. And I feel like a lot of the people who stuck with it only did so because of its connection to the original. So this low-stakes hangout sitcom kind of became a vessel for guest stars and Easter eggs, which are just not good long-term ingredients for success. In The Office's case, they'll really have to decide how much of the cast to bring back. And honestly, if I were them, I would say none. Or maybe just one single character. Initially, that would really piss off fans, and it would make the show harder to market. But I honestly think the only way it could stand on its own 2 feet in the long term is if it's just a really good comedy about an office in the 2020s and didn't mess around with cameos or guest stars until at least season 3, when the show was well established and had a fan base of its own. It's not a sitcom, but one thing I've always respected about Star Trek: The Next Generation is that, aside from the awkward and fairly brief Dr. McCoy appearance in the pilot, the writers didn't lean on original series nostalgia until TNG had firmly established itself as a popular show by the late 3rd season. As chaotic and uneven as those first 2 seasons are, the writers knew that if this show was to succeed, it would need to succeed on the basis of its own cast and its own stories. And episodes like Relics, which features a great guest turn from James Doohan, who played Scotty in the original show, didn't come along until they had that audience trust. When they knew that fans would be watching that episode for Picard just as much as they were for Scotty. I feel like that kind of discipline and trust in their own vision is very rare these days, and it's really the only way that I can see The Office reboot moving beyond being a show where every other article written about it is just speculation on if it will get Steve Carell to come back. Because unless they pay him like an absurd amount of money, I just can't see him ever agreeing to return in any substantial way. I mean, this is the actor who felt so strongly about Michael's exit in season 7 that Michael is almost non-verbal in his one appearance in season 9. Now, maybe I'm wrong. When the streaming TV money hose was still on full blast, Apple TV and Netflix both got him to do shows. But The Office, I think that's going to be a tough sell, especially when he spent so much of his career since then trying to be perceived as a dramatic actor. Now, I'm sure a lot of the rest of the cast would be very on board with coming back. John Krasinski, probably not so much, but many of the others are making their livings off of talking about the show to this day. Now, I have a ton of fondness for that cast, but I think most of these characters were pretty well spent by the end of the show's run. I just don't know if there's a lot more story or comedy that could be wrung out of like Kevin, Angela, or Creed. Well, okay, maybe Creed. But yeah, the show is already diminishing in its later years, and I'd hate to see those characters dragged back out for a forgettable show that'll just be cancelled in like 2 seasons. So if this has to happen, I really hope Greg Daniels is bold enough to do something completely new, keeping only the basic premise of working in an office intact. If they go the nostalgia baiting route, I can see it boosting Peacock subscriptions for a few months. But I'm very doubtful that they could recapture what that show had at its height. There's only a few channels I can point to and say Captain Midnight wouldn't exist if not for them, and one of them is NerdSync. where Scott has been making great pop culture videos for over a decade. And now you can learn how he puts them together. On my streaming service, Nebula Classes, he breaks it all down in a really fun and helpful way. It's something I recommend for anyone out there trying to make pop culture videos, and it's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what Nebula has to offer. I have some originals on there as well, and my videos there are always ad-free. And I'm far from alone, with great creators like Lindsay Ellis uploading exclusive videos, along with Thomas Flight, Wendover Productions, Nando V Movies, and so many more. If you sign up using the link below, you can support me directly and get both Nebula and Nebula Classes for 40% off an annual plan. Basically, just over $250 a month. It's an incredible deal on a service that just keeps getting better. So check it out right now in that link you can find in the description or pinned comment down below.
Here's a special tip for the fellas and girls who have not already joined Captain Midnight's new 1940 Flight Patrol. You'd better hurry up and join at once because there's a big adventure ahead. The thing to do now is to get started because we're going to have not only barrels of fun, but loads of free gifts and prizes too.